Hey guys, what's up? It is Ripe again, back with another exclusive Neighbors from Hell story. In this video, OP's neighbors threaten to take over the entire neighborhood and replace the houses with parking lots. This is a 3-part saga, so please watch until the end to hear the final conclusion. And now let's dive right into the stories. Today's titled story was posted by user POQWizRedux on our own subreddit r/ripestories, and the story is titled The Saga of an Awful Neighborhood Church, Part 1. This is a story that has been ongoing for more than 20 years. The cast I will introduce as they appear, since there will be many people involved over the course of the years. I was still young during this stage, so everything here is to the best of my recollection as it was told to me or as I experienced it. I will be directly involved later in this tale. Setting the stage, I live in a summer tourist town, and in this town there is a branch of a very large and international church. You likely have seen members of this church ringing bells around Christmas with their trademark red buckets to collect donated money. And by the way guys, if you know what kind of church OP is talking about, then please let me know in the comments. Anyway, their location in my town has been their yearly retreat for locations for their yearly meetings for more than 100 years. I happen to live across the street from them, and at this location, set down in a gully that formed a natural theater, they had a small stage. For about a week a year, their members would flood the town, they would have choirs, brass bands, sermons, etc. Traffic was a pain for the neighbors during this week, but it was just a week and it had been this way before anyone alive had bought their properties. Opening shots, it is the late 90s. The church has decided that it wants to renovate their stage. By renovate I mean they want to convert this small stage with wooden pews settled in a gully with 100 feet pine trees into a 1,500 seat amphitheater with a roof, stage lighting and the full production. We learned that they were making these changes when they started cutting down those massive trees. What really turned the neighborhood into a hornet's nest, however, was how they started excavating this gully. They were blowing it up with explosives. Our houses are mere yards away from where they are blasting, some houses just feet away. This is a densely packed residential neighborhood, with most houses only being around 3 to 6 feet away. For anyone who has not been around controlled explosions, it is unsettling. The whole house would shake like it was sitting on top of an unbalanced washing machine for a few seconds over and over. We were lucky since our house was about 120 feet away from where they were blasting. Some of our neighbors were literally just feet away. I cannot even imagine how it felt inside their homes. This blatant lack of care for their neighbors earned them the ire of, among many, my mother and my neighbor 1. They started digging into the details over what was going on, and boy oh boy did they find things. There was no final plan with the planning board for starters, something usually required before breaking ground. The plans that were available showed the new gigantic structure being built on top of property they did not actually own. There was a small dirt road that connected a couple of houses, and this road was a town road. Their plans showed the building being built into this road. When you use explosives, you have to notify your abutters, neighbors, but this never happened. The town planning board minutes where this project was discussed were somehow all blank. All of the meetings across multiple dates. The explosives issues had understandably gotten nearly all of the neighborhood angry. The ground is all sand and the vibrations from the explosions were causing damage to foundations, causing houses to settle, which was breaking windows, etc. Everyone organized and my mother became unofficially the leader. My mother reached out to the town planner about what was going on. She asked him how the church was allowed to continue construction when they don't have finalized plans. The town planner told my mother, "Oh, don't worry about that. We can just backdate them once we get them." I think he realizes at this moment he messed up since he went quiet and didn't answer any more questions. If you didn't already know, backdating legal documents is illegal, and admitting you would do that to the leader of a group that is looking for someone's head is just plain stupid. The church, sensing that the neighborhood is angry, as evidenced by the flood of angry letters and calls they had been receiving, decided it was time to host a meeting to try and calm everyone down. They had appointed an official representative to speak on behalf of the church rep number 1. The meeting did not go well for church rep number 1. He was faced with a lot of tough questions and was not prepared to answer them. He eventually got heated and declared, "We are going to buy all of your houses in 6 months and turn them into parking lots so I don't have to care what any of you say." Yep, not the right thing to say. Naturally, this meeting had inflamed the neighborhood and had been the catalyst for the creation of an official neighborhood association where my mother was now the leader. Not long after, church rep number 2 contacted the neighborhood to assure everyone that they were not going to buy everyone's property and turn them into parking lots. Church rep number 1 was never seen again. However, considering they had just purchased the 2 houses on that town street, leveled them and then absorbed the town street to make everything legal for their project, there was limited faith in their words. This brought up an interesting point about how this project has passed at all. Anywhere that has people attending in large numbers, there is a formula for calculating parking. This was going to be a 1,500-seat theater. Assuming 4 people to a car, they would need parking for 375 cars. The law wanted plans for 2 people per car at 750 spots. This is all in the middle of a dense residential neighborhood. How much parking did the church have at this time? Well, it was around 11 spots. 11 total spots on property that they owned even after construction would be finished. They did not have enough parking for weekly sermons, let alone full theater events. They clearly had more influence at town hall than regular residents had. However, despite having evidence of wrongdoing, the police could not/would not do anything, and the town officials had made their position clear. The church's theater will be completed. A few neighbors accepted defeat at this stage and moved away. They were the first, but certainly not the last. The stress of all of these events had a very real, measurable toll on the residents. I believe this stage also caused the death of at least 1 neighbor. I don't have proof of this, just what I believe to be the logical cause. This was an older and larger man who lived right next to where the theater was being built, in one of those houses on the now defunct town street. He was a devout member of the church, but he had a literal front row seat to the explosions and construction. He was not happy with what they were doing, but he couldn't go against his church. It was known that he was very stressed about everything going on, and he was not in the greatest health to begin with. He ended up passing away from a heart attack shortly after construction started. His father took possession of the house, but he also passed away not long after. The house then became property of the church and was promptly torn down. This was all the calm before the storm. Stay tuned for part 2, opening day, and when things get real. And guys, if you have watched until here, I would really appreciate it if you could post some star emojis in the comments and maybe even like the video if you want to support my channel. Your support means the world to me and it helps me tremendously. Thank you so much. In addition, please feel free to share your own stories on r/ripestories on Reddit, and there is a good chance that I might feature your story in a video. Anyway, now let's continue to part 2 of the saga. Part 2 of the church saga. In part 1 of this story, we covered the church's construction and related misdeeds. We now move on to the grand opening of the theater. The year is 1998 and I am 13 years old now. My mother is leading the neighborhood and is resisting the unlawful and unethical actions of the church. The grand opening is scheduled to start during the church's normal week-long meeting period they have every year. They were pulling out the stops and were going to make this a big celebration. To give you an idea of how big of a deal this was, a former US president was the keynote guest speaker of the event. This was a huge production. Now, if you can recall in part 1, there is very limited parking, 11 parking spots to be specific, for a theater that has 1,500 seats. For this event, there would likely be people standing in the aisles and standing in the open space outside of the theater. There were no walls, which we will cover later. We had seen the schedule of events and we were anticipating a crap show of parking and people loitering about in our otherwise quiet neighborhood. If anything, we had underestimated how bad it would be. Cars lined every street whether there was parking allowed or not. People were everywhere trying to park in private driveways, on sidewalks, you name it. It was chaos. These streets are narrow beach town roads with no one parking on them. You would be challenged to have 2 cars drive past each other. The parked cars made all but the main road impassable to vehicles. This had very real consequences. The first day of the event started, the roads were jammed with cars. I was riding my bike back from a friend's house on one of these streets. My bike malfunctioned, the front tire fell off because I put my own bike together and had optional pieces left over. Whoops! And I hit the ground hard. I was severely injured with what I later found out was a broken spleen. 0 out of 10, don't recommend. A resident saw me lying in a gravel patch and called 911. The ambulance only needed to drive 400 feet to get me from the fire station. I was that close. And still, it took them more than 30 minutes though, because they had to navigate through all of the parked cars on these narrow streets to find a way to get to me. The doctors had told me that if I had tried to get up and try walking, I likely would have died on the spot. I spent the next week in the hospital in ICU and recovering, so I ended up missing the former president's speech, which would have been the next day. As you can understand, the parking issues are now very real and very personal for me. From what I was told, the events were a big show and they brought in all sorts of guest speakers, choirs, bands, etc. What were little brass bands playing marching songs are now fully amplified orchestras or rock bands. The noise levels were insane. It was so loud that even with all of the windows and doors closed on the far side of the house, you could hear the music like it was being played from a radio in the room. We had accepted that during their yearly week-long event, they would be crazy. This was crazier than usual, but it is what it is and they have always had their summer event, so we let it go. We did not let go the events that scheduled after this, however. They had scheduled concerts 3 nights a week, full-out Christian rock concerts, full stacks of speakers, light shows, smoke machines, the works. It was absolutely bonkers. Really the nerve to have such insane concerts in a quiet residential neighborhood. We called in noise complaints, but there wasn't any coordination between the neighbors here, everyone just called it in. There were dozens of complaints per show, with some people calling multiple times. The parking was just as bad, but now we also included tour buses. Since the streets are narrow, the buses decided that the best place to park would be directly in front of our driveway. One evening there were 2 tour buses parked side by side in the street in front of our driveway. There was literally 1 foot of space between the building across from us and the bus, a foot between buses, the next bus, and then 2 feet of sidewalk left since they had parked on top of the sidewalk. You might be wondering, where on earth were the authorities in all of this? Well, dear readers, they were there as attendees. It seems that the church had been highly successful in converting many of the town's police officers and firefighters. Many were in the seats of these events. Those that were on duty were the ones to respond to our calls and made the complaints disappear. Later on, we had come to discover that they had no record of most of the complaints filed during this period. The fire of the neighborhood had been dying down after the construction had wrapped, but nothing inflames the passion of wronged people when the threat is active and ongoing. My parents and neighbors mobilized. Neighbor 1 lived a few houses over from us and had basically front row seats. There was nothing blocking the sound from the stage to their house. Neighbor 1 was enraged and had a temper. She was the first to start recording events to prove the sound issue. She actually had town police ask her to stop filming the event since recording devices were not allowed in the theater. She was recording on the public street directly in front of her house. My mother took the record idea and ran with it though. We bought a decibel meter to accurately measure the sound and recorded that as well as something with a time and date stamp and then called the police to report it. Sometimes the police were already standing in frame of the video. This is how things went for the first year after the theater opened for business. It was a very stressful time for the neighborhood. It was clear that the town and the police force were in with the church and that they wouldn't take action no matter how much we called to report things. So what can we do? We sued. This is when we had discovered the missing police reports, by the way. The neighborhood association had collected donations and we were able to hire a lawyer to take the case. The videos that we captured with the decibel meter were particularly damning. We took them to court on the dozens of noise violations. We ended up settling most of the charges, but there was one they admitted to because we had full video of a major Christian rock band playing the theater with a light show, smoke machines, stacks of speakers that were 15 feet tall, etc. They admitted to this count purely so the judge wouldn't get to see that video. They basically promised to reduce the volume. We promised that we would call in any event that went over the noise limit that was spelled out in the town's noise ordinances. Even knowing that the noise complaints were basically toothless, we knew that it still made the church look bad. The town was happy to go along with things so as long as the boat didn't get rocked. If there were enough complaints, the boat would eventually tip, even if they wouldn't prosecute on an individual complaint. So, game over, right? No more big concerts? Lol. If only. Their church's and town's solution to this pesky problem was to update the noise ordinance, specifically giving just the church's lot the ability to make unlimited noise until 10 p.m. and everyone around them would be kept at 55 decibels until 10 p.m. How loud is 55 decibels, you might wonder? Well, it is about the sound level of a hushed conversation. For context, the sound of wind is 45 decibels, that is how quiet everyone else has to be, but the church can crank out the noise until 10 p.m. when it goes back to the same levels as everyone else. How fortunate they are to have an ordinance just for them. Don't worry though, we still called the police when they got too loud. They made the boat harder to rock, but it can still be rocked. We also had another avenue to fight back, which was parking. Parking was still a major issue, it was still a danger and was not getting addressed. The church had made a deal to have event-goers park and at nearby town-owned baseball fields and to be bused to the theater. While it helped some, there were still hundreds of people driving around looking for somewhere to park and parking illegally. To be fair, the church cannot police the streets, you would need police for that. The police appeared disinterested in enforcing the parking laws during this time. My mother had become well known by the police chief and town officials during this time. The chief at least was not a church member and was able to assist where he could. My mother's name during this time was enough to get any official person's attention, and they knew if they tried to ignore her, things would just be worse later on. I was actually very impressed with my mother for the level of respect that people had for her and possibly some fear for her as well. She eventually even managed to contact the head leader of the church, their equivalent of a CEO/Pope. She was able to ask the man about why they built this theater in our town. We had come to learn that there was a second location in a different state that wanted a theater built there, and the community there was actively trying to get them to build there. The church leader explained that they built in my town because it was cheaper despite the residents not wanting it. He had confirmed the decision was about money, not about doing what was right. The stress of everything and the safety issues were still having a real effect on the residents. Another neighbor in between neighbor 1 and us had a small kitchen fire. Again, we are not far from the fire station and just off the main road, but they couldn't get to the house. Thankfully, these neighbors were able to put the fire out. This contributed to their decision to move away not long after. For sale signs were popping up all around the neighborhood, in fact. Neighbor 1 ended up having a full mental breakdown towards the end of this stage and largely drops out of the story. She is still living in the same place, but she took a long time to recover and couldn't handle the length of the fight. And the last part of the saga is called Coldish War. It's now the early 2000s, summer life has become a battle of parking and noise, it is a game of chicken that will last decades, long-term battles of attrition like this are not for the faint of heart and most people are not built for it. Many people came and went during these last couple of decades and many who stayed basically just gave up fighting. The church also had many new faces come and go in their official roles. I learned later on that they rotate their pastors every 18 months or so in order to prevent the pastors from having too much of a bond with the congregation. The church may sound pretty awful, they pretty much are, but I don't want anyone to confuse the misdeeds of the church with the church members. Most were good people and some were even part of the neighborhood resistance for a short while. It is the church leadership that was and is the issue and the directives that they issue. The first 2 years were the roughest by far, as outlined in parts 1 and 2. As we moved from the 1990s and into the 2000s, things started to slow down for the church events. The church decided that having the big Christian rock bands were more trouble than they are worth, they would still have smaller bands play and not just religious groups. They were renting out their facility to anyone willing to pay. If they kept it at reasonable levels, we wouldn't call it in. If they were too loud, we called it in. If someone was parked illegally outside of our houses, we would call that in as well as needed. As new faces started rotating in the church, they tried to mend bridges. There was not much they could do since they couldn't control people parking more than we could and the concerts were scheduled by church leadership, but the gesture was at least appreciated. This is about when we learned the reason why the church wanted to renovate their theater and have concerts there. The church was old. What I mean by that is that its members were old. There were very few young people in the church. They rebuilt the theater specifically to get young people going to the church and hoping that they will convert or at least give them some money. They contracted with my high school to hold graduation ceremonies at the theater. Now, I had a big issue with this. Aside from my personal involvement with their nonsense over the years, I believe wholeheartedly in the separation of church and state. They should not mix ever. Holding the graduation in a church I felt was tantamount to endorsing that religion. I raised my concerns to the school and they told me that it wasn't a church, that it was a facility. I pointed out the plaque on the front of the building that memorializes the date it was consecrated and blessed. The school pointed out their real motivation. It was cheap. The church had given them a great deal to have all those young people forced to attend their church. Well, I was not about to cave to that BS. I refused to go to my own graduation. Now that got some attention. I got pulled into meetings at school to talk with the principal and vice principal, guidance counselors, etc. I was resolute. They called my parents to try and convince them to let me go. They were shocked to learn that this was my idea and not theirs. They were not forcing me to do anything, not that they could anyway. I do what I want, and supported me with whatever choice I made. The school backed off until a few days before the ceremony. They were convinced that I was going to back down at the end and walk with the rest of my class. I did not back down though. The day of the graduation came and I was able to watch it all from my yard. I made sure to not leave my property though, in case it could be viewed that I was part of the ceremony across the street. The principal ended up coming to my house after the ceremony and basically gave me my own private graduation in my yard and commended me on sticking to my guns. I couldn't stop the graduations from happening at the theater, but at the very least I could be as annoying to them as they were to us. For a few years after this, I would set up with my friends on the street side and play our little garage band that we had assembled. We were not terrible, but we weren't good either. I made sure to stop playing when the school band was playing though, and when the kids were marching, I'm not a total a-hole. As time went on, things basically turned into petty revenge territory. They would have obnoxious concerts and we would mow the lawn during their sermons. They wouldn't control their guests and had them loitering everywhere. I put the trash out early and made sure there was some dog poop that had been festering in the sun right on top. Their guests would park illegally. I would call in parking enforcement and make sure they got a ticket. Around this time, my parents were losing their stamina for dealing with this all summer. They bought a camper and went RVing all summer long so they didn't have to deal with it anymore. I cannot blame them. They fought the hardest and longest and were left to fight on their own after most of the neighborhood lost their stomach for the fighting. I did what I could to keep up the fight as best as I could. I knew it was a situation where if you gave them an inch, they'd take a mile. Years passed like this, and as time went on, fewer and fewer groups were playing the theater. Whether the groups themselves decided it was a pain to play there, or the new faces that were running everything were able to crack down on bands misbehaving, I'm not sure. The town leadership changed also during this time. The town council, made up of 5 career local politicians, was recalled. Only one kept their job. The new council is still very business friendly, but they don't appear to be in as tight with the church. The church may have recognized it was in its own interest not to be getting tons of complaints. The bottom line was, over time, we had effectively achieved an acceptable peace on the noise issues. No one won here outright, but we can live with each other again. Parking was another matter. While I would estimate that the noise issues were largely resolved by 2010 or so, parking and traffic continued to be awful. The church, for its part, recognized that it needed to do something and designated no parking areas on the property it owned and expanded some parking areas so they had approximately 50 to 60 spots now. Also, they did end up buying houses and tearing them down for parking, by the way. They had contracted with a local bus company to bus people from the main parking area across town, but many people were opting to drive their groups up to the front doors, let everyone get out of the car and then go park their car. Seems reasonable, but when you have dozens of people who have the same idea on narrow streets, you get a traffic jam. People walk across the streets, ignoring the traffic that is there, causing more issues. The theater is no smoking, so we would have people come into my driveway and lean against my garage to smoke instead. The police ended up stationing an officer at the head of the road. In the beginning, this officer was useless. The officers that ended up taking this duty were nearly always church members and were clearly using their power to support the madness that was happening. They literally refused to do anything about the parking or poor crowd control. Despite my mother having contacts with the chief of police, these officers would not do anything. What can be done here? Well, I basically called the police on the police. I would stand outside my house, take some pictures of the cop doing nothing while it is chaos in the streets, and then call the non-emergency line. I described the issue to dispatch, and each time they would type things in and then say, "Wait, we already have an officer on location." I would reply with, "I know." I am standing in front of them, watching them do absolutely nothing. I've already tried to talk to them. We would end the call, and a minute later I would get an awful look from the officer, and then they would go do their job. It only took 2 to 3 times doing this before we had different officers on this specific duty, and those officers took control of the situation. We finally got the tour buses to stop parking directly in front of our driveway by calling in a complaint each time they did. Granted, they just moved up to the next house and did it there until they complained as well. And then they decided the best action would be to have the drivers sit in the buses with them idling so they were not parked. They were waiting for passengers. When you have multiple buses idling outside your window at 8 PM at night for hours, it is loud and smelly. That got calls in as well. They eventually moved their bus stop in front of the church and kept just one bus there. Pulled part way onto their lawn, that is fine, they are not blocking traffic or letting it idle. Another acceptable piece has been achieved. Their event staff eventually found their rhythm and started directing anyone dropping people off to go park and take the bus, unless they were handicapped, of course. With these issues handled, relations thawed with the local church members, and I personally have a good working relationship with their head groundskeeper. We both try to have a live and let live attitude these days. No one wants to live in a state of anxiety and be ready to fight, me included. The church locals seem to recognize having to play nice with neighbors again, just like they had before all of this started. The church leadership that is out of state though, they are still a-holes. That hasn't changed. The final parking battle occurred about 5 years ago now. The church can only control what is on their property or what is right in front of them. They cannot hire a private police force to police the neighborhood for parking violations. Parking enforcement only goes through residential neighborhoods when called in. Since people were still parking like jerks outside of the sideline of the event staff, I called parking enforcement religiously. The opposite side of my house from the theater, the street there is no parking, but it was not signed very well. Locals knew not to park there though, and there were never locals parked on that street. It was safe to say that if there was a car parked there, it was a theater guest not playing by the rules. This was a main road through my neighborhood, but it was still narrow. With cars parked on just one side, you still couldn't have two cars safely pass each other going down it. I must have made the parking enforcement team a ton of money. The final straw for parking enforcement though was during an all-day event at the theater. I ended up calling them in 3 separate times for 3 separate batches of illegally parked cars. After the third call, all of a sudden there were yellow signs on every telephone pole and sign pole on the whole street. The signs were all, by order of police, temporary parking ban, no parking. It was the sweet taste of victory. Even more amazing, however, was that the signs actually worked. A few weeks later, they were replaced with permanent no parking signs, and there hasn't been an issue on that street since. Aftermath of the whole story: we have achieved our acceptable peace with the church. Neither side had a full victory, but we both have enough of what we wanted to live in peace. My house is not a parking lot, and they still have concerts throughout the summer. As with any war though, there are casualties. Many people came and went in the neighborhood. My parents accepted defeat in the early 2010s and sold the family home to my brother. My brother and his family in turn lived there for about 5 years, fought the fight, and then sold the house also to get away from the church and its nonsense. As for me, I'm not going anywhere. I'm happy to have everyone live together in peace, but I am fully prepared to fight again if the church starts acting up again. It only takes some new a-hole in the church leadership to decide they want to start trouble again. And yeah, Ripe Stars, that is unfortunately the end of this epic saga. Thank you so much for user PogWizRedux for this amazing, interesting story. And Ripe Stars, with this we have unfortunately reached the end of today's video. However, if you cannot get enough of my stories, then I would highly suggest you to check out my endless binge watch playlist, which will show up at any moment in the left corner of the screen, which includes over 1000 Ripe stories. In addition, if you would like to share one of your own stories, then please head on over to r/ripestories on Reddit, where you can post your own story and there is a good chance that I might read it in a video. In addition, please also check out my Patreon at patreon.com/ripeyoutube for more than 50 exclusive Reddit videos that you won't find on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. Your daily support is very much appreciated, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.